Hello, everyone. I'm Casey Loftman, Editor-in-Chief of Food Engineering Magazine. Joining me today are Phil Kafarakis, President of Specialty Foods Association, and Betsy Boreen, Senior Vice President of Regulatory and Technical Affairs for the Consumer Brands Association. We're going to be discussing the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and how processors are responding, not only from a worker safety and availability standpoint, but as operations start to get back to something approaching normal. Phil, Betsy, thank you for joining me today.
I think great to be with you.
Thanks to have us.
Okay, and to get started, I'd like to first start talking about how processors are managing worker safety and availability. This has been a big issue that we've seen in a lot of different companies, kind of all different sizes, all different products that they're making. How are they protecting their workers and making sure that they're available when they need them for production purposes? So, Phil, I'd like to start with you. From a specialty foods perspective, a lot of the companies that you represent are smaller companies that have smaller workforces. How are they protecting those workforces and making sure that they have enough people?
Yeah, the interesting dynamic is a majority of our members rely on co-packing. However, our larger members have plants and in the process here of transitioning have really relied on their local state mandates and have become very engaged, particularly with respect to the worker's family, not just the worker themselves. So they're doing all the things you hear about with respect to PPE and making sure they're going as far as taking temperatures and providing direction with social distancing. Some are even doing tracing. And at this point, I think part of this concern is just part of the cultural values that some of these smaller companies, mid-sized companies have always had about, making them part of the family. So to that degree, I think those standards are being met. And then there's a social side that we hear about with respect to making sure that folks are getting some food to take home. They have some a local touch with respect to what is going on in the local community, and trying to assist the small businesses that are part of that ecosystem.
And Betsy, I know that your association represents not just food companies, but a lot of other consumer packaged goods companies. So from a broader perspective, what are you seeing in the companies that you represent? Is it similar to what Phil has described?
Yeah, very much so. I think, as we consider this situation, and I think it's important to take a minute and think about where we were and where some people were looking at the situation in January, February, early March, mid-March, end of March, 2 days after that. This situation has evolved so quickly, but I don't think what hasn't changed is making sure employee and product safety remains the highest priorities. And that's been the case with our members. The manufacturing facilities and corporate facilities are taking extra steps to make sure that they are using best practices and guidance from all federal agencies, whether it's CDC, OSHA, FDA, EPA, and DHS. And so they are implementing those recommendations in their facilities and, working with their teams to make sure they have the confidence to come to work and react when people have positive cases. So I think our system is working. It's definitely been stressed during this time, but remaining employee safety and product safety are still some of our highest priorities.
Right, and I know that you can't talk about the specifics of specific companies, but just is there kind of a universal method that companies are using right now? Is it, everybody's doing temperature checks or everybody's trying to provide PPE? Or does it really vary based on exactly what the company is making and exactly how their workforce comes together?
I think in many cases, the answer is yes to both. I know that we have, and we've been working with our members and convening them in meaningful ways particularly as we didn't understand the situation early on. And so we've been holding and convening industry together to share best practices. Many of those best practices have been finalized through the Food Beverage Issues Alliance. And those best practices are on a website, www.feedingus.org. And that really represents some of the industry's best practices. We're starting to see those types of recommendations. Of course, there was a little bit of delay from federal agencies, but many of those practices are supported, endorsed through other federal guidance. But it's really a spectrum of what is being done. And it, to your point, it depends on the location and the products being made. So manufacturing facilities bring a whole different set of situations than perhaps the general public is aware of. Companies are using that guidance to consider their risks in their facilities, the risks to the employees, in developing those comprehensive programs.
And Phil, is that similar to what you're seeing with the specialty foods manufacturers?
Yeah, I would definitely, I would agree for sure. There's, in our environment, our members are dealing more with the process side, the packaging side, particularly, again, with a co-pack environment where there's a portion of it that comes through a plant and then has to be further processed or further packaged. Definitely varies by product categories, specifically with respect to, you know, when you're in dry goods or you're in perishables, or look what's going on in meat. But I think the standards and the rules are ones that everybody's trying to comply with. There is this element of unknown. I mean, there's still this notion of what is the real new normal going to be when, you know, USDA or FDA starts changing things like HACCP protocols and starts adding to those to develop an element of safety and an element of, you know, greater sense of urgency with cleaning and wash down environments, those type of things. But I think we're all reading off the same handbook. I think the other thing that's important to all of us, the cultural aspects of some of our smaller companies these are things that are done day to day, that are part of their work environment, their plants. They've always tried to get beyond some of the federal guidelines because the specialty nature of some of the goods and the ingredients that flow through there. But I think the big thing is trying to learn from everybody and gathering all this information and understanding, like, how does that now, how is it going to be implemented going forward with respect to changes that might have to be made, physical changes that might have to be made in a plant environment? And then how do you manage that with your co-packer who's got 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 more like you, who is either going to come up with one standard, or are they going to run a standard that's unique to my product, and then my QA people are going to go in there and tell them what to do with my product? So I think that's where we start to get to where it gets a little fuzzy. But again, I think the more we share across industry and the more the food industry together collaborates, the better it's going to be for all of us.
Right, and you mentioned something that's presented an interesting challenge to the food and beverage industry, which is that, you know, food and beverage processors, they know how to handle food safety. They know how to handle cleaning and sanitation and all of those things. There are standards in place. There are companies that, as you mentioned, many of whom exceed those standards because they have their own requirements. But this is kind of an interesting new aspect of worker safety that they haven't really had to deal with before. They have guidelines in place for slip and fall injuries and things like that. But when we're talking about, you know, something that's a viral spread, that's not really something that they've had to deal with before. So how are they adapting some of their existing plans to say, okay, maybe this is how we can deal with this?
I think for us, one of the things that people are telling us is happening is all of a sudden you have medical professionals on site, or they're timed in to come and make sure that they're checking on people beyond just regular, you know, temperature checks, but making sure people are healthy, making sure that they're available, which is an element that you know, maybe in big plant environments, you used to have that, but now I think that's a standard component of what you're going to do if you're in an operating environment that's, you know, complete supply chain processing. Small change, but incremental cost, more subject matter expertise, and a lot more connectivity to, you know, staff and workforce, keeping them healthy, wellness, beyond just making sure they've got a mask and they took a temperature.
And Betsy, how's that applying to the companies that you represent?
I think it's been challenging, and I think we've seen the challenges in this unique situation, because I would say all of our industry, whether it's food, personal care, household, they have systems in place. They're proactive systems in place to ensure product safety. They're mitigating risks. They take that proactive response. And then they have the occupational health aspects of running those businesses. Again, proactively have things in place, have requirements, And what we have here is a situation of a public health crisis that's overlaying both of those issues, but it's not really the important issue. We don't have a product safety problem right now. We have a public health crisis globally that as humans are getting it and they're dealing with their day-to-day lives, it may impact them. And so today, consumer brands with other trade associations made a request because what we've seen is a disconnect. The agencies putting out guidance have been phenomenal. They have been timely. As we've provided them requests, they've answered them. But the challenges and what we're discovering we need is more of a coordinated, integrated approach to those guidances, and I can give the example that the meat and poultry industry received an integrated guidance that dealt with both food safety and inspection service as well as OSHA. And that was really important because those separate lanes of guidance, while important, weren't perhaps applicable to the current crisis. And I think having more of that integrated approach is important. So we're having a lot of the same issues that I think some of the more specialty foods issues at a different scale. But, to give an example, if you consider high touch spots in a manufacturing facility, handrails could be one of them. If you think about your OSHA regulations, those handrails are there for a reason. It's probably the environment is needed to have that sort of handrail. There are probably strict regulations in place that employees need to use them when they're available. But in this situation, we heard some stories of public health officials saying, well, that's a high touch environment, take that out. Well, you can't do that. Now you're putting workers in a different level of risk. And so companies, federal officials, public health officials are learning all of this as we're addressing almost every issue. And so what becomes a solution? Well, in this case, is it that we have to have more robust cleaning and disinfectants on those high-touch environments? Because those handrails are necessary to prevent slips and falls. So we're balancing a lot of that out. And I would say, as someone who's been in food policy and dealt with animal health issues, public health issues, I've never experienced a situation like this before where we've had to integrate all of these lessons and then apply them in very new ways. For many of us, this is a brand new frontier on these types of guidance, which is why we asked today the Vice President, as chairman of the White House Coronavirus Task Force, to help us with this integrated need for guidance.
Right, and I'd like to explore that a little bit more. As you mentioned, the Consumer Brands Association, along with the number of other associations, sent this letter basically, to sum it up, saying we don't have the guidance that we need because, as you mentioned, it's sort of all over the place. It might be one thing from CDC, another thing from OSHA, another thing from FDA, maybe even another thing from USDA, and processors and other consumer packaged goods companies look at this and say, okay, I don't know where to start. I don't know which of these overrules the others. And then there's also, this state is telling me this, while a facility in another state is being told this. So Phil, I'd like to start with you and then definitely come back to Betsy on this, but what are your members seeing in terms of some of these regulatory issues where they might be, one state might be saying one thing, the neighboring state might be saying another thing, and the federal government might be saying a third thing?
Yeah, definitely with what Betsy said, that not only is it a challenge, but there's chaos and confusion, particularly when you think the lack of integration, because that was an excellent example with the railings. In a small business environment, we're grateful the bigger associations are setting some of the standards, because for us it's a timing function. We take much longer to try to implement some of these changes when you think about how they are part of a small processing environment, and then they affect us differently too because of how the sizes of the batching that we're accustomed to, or the packaging that we're accustomed to. So the absolute biggest concern here is making sure the legislative environment, the regulatory environment, not only is coordinated, but is educated on what is taking place, because we're going to have bureaucrats all over the place telling the manufacturing community, the food community, what to do, which sometimes is a little dangerous. And it really does require an element of coordination and study so that voices are heard, the different tiers of manufacturing are represented. So when these things come down the pike, maybe a big company can get it done in a year or change their packaging out in 2 years. A smaller company is going to need 3 or 4 years to do some of these smaller things just because of the way it's scaled. And that's why we're all unified in this and try to coordinate, because I guess the biggest thing for us coming out of this is there's no more on your own. You're either in it together and you're sharing information and collaborating and there's transparency, or you're out there on an island and it's going to be a long haul for somebody who wants to take this on by themselves and not come together as a coordinated industry approach. And I think we're grateful for all the resources we have, including the ability to talk to our partners and our peers across the associations. We're all segmented too, by the way. The days of the channels are over. So
right.
we're agnostic to channels, whether you're food service, retail, convenience store, food trucks, online. We broke that model up about 5 years ago as we started to reposition ourselves. Same thing is happening with the other associations. Food's made everywhere. It's meeting the consumer where the consumer wants it. So the implications of food service today they just don't affect one group of people. Yeah, there's a majority in food service, but everybody's in food service, to some degree. So I think that's why this is such an important time to be educating not only the public, but also, the legislative environment has to really get their head around integration, because it's been a problem for years. And we haven't started talking about the unions and how they represent the workforce and their voice, which is really important.
And Betsy, to build on Phil's point, he mentioned this idea that it's been a long time where this has been an issue, this communication and coordination between different agencies that might have a say over different parts of the production process. But now it's really coming into focus just how much of a challenge that is when we need to have a quick, coordinated response to something like this.
Yeah, and I think that's true, and we see it. And usually these situations we can work through. No one wants to have a foodborne outbreak. No one wants an animal health outbreak. They're very separate issues, but we've worked through those, and we had a system. With this unique crisis, it's become more apparent how the speed of the crisis perhaps is dictating. And I want to be clear, our partners at FDA, EPA, and FSIS have been outstanding. We are, and I would say, I view them as collaborators. We're asking questions. I think what will hopefully be a positive outcome of this is that relationship on how we best can serve to making sure that we protect public safety, product safety, and worker safety. I'm optimistic, glass half full, that this is going to lead to a better private-public partnership on many of these issues, which is fantastic. It's sad to say that this type of crisis elevated to that, but we've always at Consumer Brands had a very good relationship with regulators as we've worked with them on behalf of our members to work on policy issues. This is, I think, we'll build on that. I would also want to highlight that I think knowledge in this type of situation is power. And I have to say I was very proud to be at Consumer Brands when we just made the decision early on in, I believe, late March to lift our membership wall when it came to COVID activities. My experience is this is a non-competitive type of situation. We need to share information. We need to learn from each other. And it's been very gratifying as a staff, and as I've been motivating my team who are working from home, but our organization was putting out daily updates on the regulatory affairs side alone. We're now doing it 3 times a week. We're holding various calls. And I think as an industry as a whole, hearing from your peers as they're experiencing perhaps a little different, but the same things has helped them. That has also provided us, going back to the guidance, real tangible examples of how and where we might need some guidance on. And the only way we're getting to those real world situations is by bringing people together and providing an environment where they can share. And so we're able to take those learnings, figure out what is needed, and then communicate that to our federal partners. And so this integrated policy becomes even more important now because this isn't, a random scenario. I can say I've been talking across, we're seeing differences in states. here's a few examples of why I think this type of guidance is needed, because it's not a one-off. But those in these type of crisis, we made that acknowledgement that that's the kind of system we thought we needed, and I think it's been really beneficial.
Right, and as Phil mentioned there, when he talked about breaking down channels, it seems like that's kind of the issue right now, is that there are all these different channels. From what I've heard, people are saying, okay, yeah, we're getting really good information from FDA, FSIS, OSHA, CDC, whoever it might be, but when those things start to clash, there's nobody to break the tie, so to speak. There's nobody saying, okay, this should take priority over this, and people are often sort of left to their own devices to figure it out.
I would say generally my experience has been, is that usually when we get federal guidance, it has been cleared through the various agencies. That's been some of the challenges, is because it is taking longer time, which is why we think a more coordinated approach might be a more efficient way of getting that guidance. But I think what we've learned is we know what we know, and what we don't know is much larger than what we know. And so to your point about we're trying to put this all together, every day I find something out and it's like, I don't know the answer to that. And so we've got to start digging into it to help provide those answers to our members. And we've been doing this for 7 weeks now. And we're getting different questions as this scenario evolves. I think it's going to be really interesting, and it's why right now we made the ask for coordinated federal guidance, is because as states start reopening, we probably need this coordinated approach even more now than we perhaps did in the beginning of the emergency, because we've learned from those few weeks. And so how is this going to happen county to county, city to city, state by state? We really need coordinated guidance.
The other part of that, which is absolutely correct, is we haven't even discussed what's happening with imports and exporting and the global supply chain environment. And that's a big part of what we do with respect to not only the membership, but then how we bring it forth, because we're not a legislative powerhouse here. We're more about the commerce side of business and making sure some of these small businesses start, small, and then they end up creating new categories. When you think about what's going on with, plant-based meat and what's happened with group business, etc. But one of the concerns here is that it takes a significant amount of time to develop these standards and go through the hearings and get the information and finally get some kind of decision. And I would agree with Betsy that if we can all, large and small, get together and be able to have that ability to communicate how it impacts our members, we'll probably get decisions faster, and we'll be able to create some of these new processes that are still undefined, faster and more efficient than trying to go through the traditional standards of what happens when you're lobbying on the Hill or working in a regulatory environment. It's not that they're not cooperative, and it's not that they can't help. They're becoming much more sophisticated and understand some of the issues in the businesses. But I think there's so many priorities going on right now all across the legislative environment that if you're not there, it's going to happen fast, and you're going to be on the outside looking in to change, to undo something that you can set forward in motion now. And I think that's part of, small business environment. You've got these small companies. What are they going to do first? Are they going to be writing letters to their congressman and making sure they're up on the regulatory environment, or are they going to get their bills paid? They're going to keep their cash flow going and liquidity. So there are some strains here that put priorities first, but you need the reliance. Like, we follow what CBA does and all their great research and information and materials they put up and share it. But in our environment, we don't have companies that have departments that do nothing but regulatory affairs. So that's part of the challenge, smaller environment, and that's why the coming together piece is so very important right now.
Right, definitely. As you both mentioned, this idea that maybe this will drive some greater collaboration is a good thing to come out of this. And I would like to spend a couple minutes here talking about what we kind of see, going forward. And I know that it's really hard to predict with any certainty what exactly this is going to mean. but just based on the feedback that you've gotten from your members and the challenges that they're dealing with and how they're handling them, what do you think is going to be the biggest thing going forward that we learn from this and apply to future operations? And Phil, I'd like to go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, I think when you bring all of this together, the consumer is desensitized now. So there is going to be a massive attempt to understand the new consumer habits. All of those have changed. A lot's taking place. So the days of holding on to that data, I think Betsy said it early on, and trying to use it as a competitive, advantage in a particular product category or in a particular channel of the food service, the food environment, is going to be a bad situation. I think where this is going to, transparency and sharing and alignment are going to be the new norms, and you're going to have to find other things to have competitive advantage on. Only in that, those are the things that are going to be of value to whether it's a food service operator trying to get back into a new business model, or a retailer that's trying to figure out how they're going to get back into doing business. And I think that's one of the big things we're trying to get our arms around. The community here, being small entrepreneurial, is always hung together. Their competitive spirit is found in different ways, but they've always been able to share information and always been able to come together to help each other through it. So I think that's going to be one of the game changers here: transparency, sharing of information, and completely being aligned with who you serve, whether it's a food service operation or whether it's a retailer. It's going to be a deeper level of engagement instead of the wider cast the net and run that kind of business model. So I think that's what we're trying to figure out. And man, there are so many variables. I don't know who's got the answer, but I'm listening to everything everybody says, no matter how kooky it is. It makes sense to me now because I have no idea where this is going.
And Betsy?
Yeah, I would say, and I want to go back to something Phil mentioned earlier, was about supply chain. I think how we have viewed supply chain has fundamentally changed. It was important before. Our organization, as we reimagined ourselves from the Grocery Manufacturers Association to Consumer Brands, we officially rebranded ourselves at the beginning of the year. And part of that was highlighting supply chain as one of our fundamental pillars. This crisis has really demonstrated how important that supply chain is, which is why we led the call to ask for an Office of Supply Chain at the White House, which is why we've created and worked to have a Congressional Supply Chain Caucus. And even yesterday, the official announcement of a Critical Infrastructure Supply Chain Council, which is built up of many of the trade associations to deal with supply chain issues, was brought together. And so I think this level of collaboration, I don't see that going away. How that may evolve as the crisis evolves, I think that'll be interesting, and once the crisis passes. But supply chain the importance of that is, I don't think, ever going to go away. What has changed and what the future could hold, I don't know. Here's what I do know. I think how we convene people, whether that's going to work, having in-person meetings, business travel, is all changing. As we've talked to our CEO members and my peers at the senior level of regulatory affairs and scientific, all of that is evolving. We don't have any clear answers yet. What we have learned is people can work well remotely. There are clearly parts of what we are learning in the manufacturing facilities that are probably going to be permanent. I think we will see fundamental changes probably in common areas, break rooms, locker rooms, cafeterias, to address this other component of person-to-person contact. So how do you protect workers and yet provide that sense of community? And so it's been very innovative as we see manufacturers create those common spaces where their employees still can connect with each other, because that's important. So all of those aspects, I think, are starting to factor in. What does it mean for contact tracing? Is that something that's going to end once this crisis is over? Depending on your type of facility, if you are a ready-to-eat facility, employee movement for food safety has always been important. How is that going to be applied more broadly? I think all of those things, as we get over the immediate emergency of the situation and start going to the next phase of, is this our new normal for 6 months, a year, 2 years? We're going to start finding out what will sort of stick, hold in place. But those are some high level aspects.
Great, thank you. That's all the time we have today, but I'd like to extend my thanks to Phil Kafarakis, President of the Specialty Foods Association, and Dr. Betsy Bereen, Senior Vice President of Regulatory and Technical Affairs from the Consumer Brands Association. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Casey.